Marin hit the cold stone floor of the great hall before she understood she was falling. The iron shackle on her left wrist had caught the edge of the dais, and her palm came down flat on the slate, the crack of it loud enough that the pack around her went silent. 43 faces. She had time to count them in the stretched second before she pushed herself upright, and not one of them moved. They stood in their semicircle behind the carved benches, breath held, waiting for what came next, and she understood then that they already knew what came next. She was the only one in the room who had not been told. Fenris stood at the front of the dais. He wore his alpha's collar, the dark iron links across his collarbone that he only put on for formal rulings, and his hands were folded behind his back in that old, practiced way that meant he had already decided and was only performing the announcement for the record. The bond between them was a living thing behind her sternum. She had felt it every day for 3 years, and now it pulled tight and thin, like a wire drawn through her chest from the inside, like something being slowly cut. She had not seen him in 4 days. She had spent those 4 days believing it was grief after the solstice rite, that he was withdrawing to process something they would eventually discuss together. She had cooked for him. She had left meals outside the door of his study. She understood now that he had been in that room for 4 days, not grieving, but drafting the order that the keeper was now reading aloud. The keeper's voice was steady and uninflected. By order of the Alpha of the Duskvale Pack, the mated female Marin of no bloodline standing is hereby exiled from Pack territory, effective at dawn of this day, for the offense of ritual interference at the solstice binding. The words arranged themselves in Marin's hearing without quite landing. Ritual interference. She had walked into the binding circle because Fenris had asked her to stand beside him. She had heard him say it. He had placed her hand on the stone himself. The wire behind her sternum pulled tighter. The bond sang like a struck bell, resonant and wrong. She looked at Fenris. He looked at the middle distance above her left shoulder, the way judges had always looked at condemned people in every court that had ever existed, as though seeing them directly would complicate what was already done. She did not scream. She picked herself up from the floor, and she let the keeper finish reading, and she carried the word exile in her body like a stone she would deal with later. She had 3 hours before dawn. Those 3 hours were nothing, and they were everything. Marin had arrived in Duskvale 6 years ago at the age of 22, carrying a pack from the lowland settlement where she had been raised without a bloodline name, without wolfkin parents, without the legacy that pack-born wolves carried in their marrow. She had come because she had felt something calling, a directional pull in her chest she couldn't name and couldn't ignore, and because the lowland settlement had nothing left to offer her. She had come with 30 silver coins, a knowledge of healer's herbs that the settlement elder had taught her grudgingly over a decade, and a stubbornness that even she sometimes mistook for courage. Duskvale sat in the high forest. It was a true pack, old and territorial, and the gatehouse guard had looked at her for a long moment before stepping aside, because she had looked directly at him and not looked away, and something in the contact between their eyes had given him pause. She learned later that Fenris had been watching from the second-floor window of the lodge. She learned this from Fenris himself, much later, in the way people confessed things to each other after they had decided to trust. She had been given provisional status and assigned to the healer's house, where the pack elder Corinna ran a tight operation and had no patience for sentiment. Corinna had tested her knowledge by handing her a tray of roots without labels. Marin had named every one. She had been kept on. The first time she saw Fenris at close range was 2 weeks into her time at Duskvale. She had been moving through the main hall carrying dried herbs in a linen wrap when he came around the corner from the upper corridor, and the collision was his fault and hers equally, and she would remember for years afterward the exact quality of the moment when he caught the linen wrap before the herbs could scatter. Not catching her arm, not reaching for her in any of the ways men in packs reached for unattached women, but catching the work first, as though he understood that was what mattered to her most. "Nettle and yarrow," he said, looking at what he held without looking at her, and he sounded genuinely interested. "Are you working on the fever remedy?" "I'm working on a wound-closing poultice. The yarrow is for clotting." She had meant it to come out neutrally, and it came out with a small edge, because she was still not certain whether the people of Duskvale were going to find a reason to rescind her provisional status, and edge was her default protection. The nettle is for drawing heat. He handed the wrap back to her carefully, then he looked at her face. And something happened in the space between their eyes that she had no accurate language for. Not attraction, not yet, because attraction was smaller and more familiar than what this was. It was recognition. The particular shock of seeing a face you feel you have always known. She stood with the linen wrap between her palms and felt the bond begin, like a root unfurling in wet soil. Soundless, certain, irreversible. He said, "I'm Fenris, not Alpha Fenris, not the formal territory declaration. Just his name, offered flat and simply." "Marin," she said. They stood in the hallway for another 6 seconds before she stepped around him and continued toward the healer's house, and her hands did not shake until she was through the door. The following weeks became months, and the bond grew the way root systems grew, outward and downward, and without her permission. She was not supposed to catch the Alpha's attention. She was not supposed to be anything more than a capable healer of uncertain provenance, and she tried, for a time, to make that be true. She poured herself into the work. Corinna pushed her harder and harder as she proved herself, and Marin accepted every task, because work was a place where she knew the rules. Fenris found other pretexts. A question about a pack member's fever that any of 3 people could have answered. A late errand to the healer's house that placed him in Marin's workspace when everyone else had gone to evening meal. She was not fooled by the pretexts, but she didn't name them either, because naming them would have made them a choice she had to respond to, and she was not yet ready. It was the night of the midwinter storm, 8 months after she arrived, that things became irreversible. A runner from the eastern edge of the territory came in with a deep gash across his forearm. A branch, no malice, but the cold had narrowed his vessels and she needed help holding pressure while she worked. Fenris was the one who came to the healer's house when she sent word. He sat across from her in the low light with the runner's arm between them, pressing steady, 2-handed pressure exactly where she showed him, and he watched her work with the specific, focused attention of someone who genuinely wanted to learn, not someone waiting for their part to be over. When the runner had been wrapped and settled, Fenris stayed. Marin cleaned the instruments and didn't tell him to leave. The storm pressed at the shuttered windows, and the hearth was the only warm thing in the room, and she asked him, finally, without looking up from the workbench, "What is it that you actually want?" The bond thrummed between them. She felt him feel it, a slight shift in his posture, a tension through the shoulders that eased rather than tightened. "I want to know who you are," he said. "Not what you know, who you are." That answer cracked something open in her that had been shut for a long time. Something built during the years in the lowland settlement when she had learned to make herself small and competent and unremarkable so that no one would have cause to question whether she should be allowed to stay. She told him about the settlement that night, about her parents who had not been wolves and had not survived the sickness that came through when she was 11, about the elder who had kept her on out of usefulness rather than kindness, about the pull in her chest that had led her north, toward his territory, without a name for what she was following. He told her, in return, about the weight of the alpha collar, about the pack's expectation that he would take a bloodline mate before the solstice binding to secure the territory's ritual legitimacy, about the feeling he had had, watching her walk through the gatehouse, that something had arrived and he could not yet tell what it would cost him. 2 months later, he asked her to accept the mate bond. Formally. On record. He put her hand on the binding stone and spoke her name in front of Corinna and the keeper, and the bond that had been growing in secret for 8 months flared into something acknowledged and real. She had understood, from the first day, that there would be people in the pack who resisted her status. She had been gracious about it. She had learned the rituals, studied the bloodline histories, shown up early and stayed late, and given the skeptics no purchase. She had done this for 3 years. And then, the solstice binding had come. The solstice binding was the most significant ritual of the pack's year. It required the alpha and his bonded mate to stand at the center of the binding circle while the keeper sealed the territorial claim for another turning. Marin had prepared for it the way she prepared for everything, thoroughly. She had read the ritual texts. She had asked Corinna every question she could think of. She had practiced the ceremonial words until she said them in her sleep. Fenris had placed her hand on the stone himself. She had felt the ritual power move through the circle like warm water, and she had done exactly what the texts required. 3 days later, the keeper came to her with a scroll. Someone had filed a claim with the council that Marin's participation in the binding had violated the bloodline requirement, that the ritual text, properly interpreted, required the alpha's mate to carry wolfkin lineage through at least one parent. The claim had been filed by Council Elder Veer, the oldest of the pack's council members, who had opposed Marin's mated status from the first week and had been quiet about it for 3 years in a way that Marin had never quite stopped watching. The keeper had told her, carefully, that the alpha had received the claim. Marin had waited for Fenris to tell her what they were going to do about it together. The door to his study had remained closed for 4 days. The exile order fell before dawn on the 5th day, and Marin understood, with the precision of someone who had spent 25 years calculating survival odds, that Fenris had not simply failed to defend her. He had signed the order. He had chosen to frame the ritual interference claim as her error rather than contest it at the council. He had handed her to Veer's interpretation rather than stand in front of his own pack and say, "She is mine, and her blood is not what makes that true." The bond was still there. She could feel it even now as she stood in the early dark outside the pack's border, her pack from her healer's house on her back, the iron shackle removed at the gate by a young guard who had not been able to meet her eyes. The bond pulled at her from the direction of the lodge, warm and persistent, entirely indifferent to what Fenris had done with his hands and his signature. She turned her back on it. She walked north. The outer forest closed behind her like water over a stone. Marin had not been exiled into emptiness. The territory north of Duskvale's claim was called the Harrowing, and it had that name for a reason. No pack held it. It was old-growth forest that climbed into the Greyvale Mountains, and the animals that lived in it were older and stranger than the wolves of the southern territories, and the stories about what else lived there had been used by Duskvale elders for 3 generations to keep the younger pack members close to home. The stories, it turned out, were partially accurate. She had been in the Harrowing for 2 days, moving carefully, eating from the dried stores she had been sensible enough to pack, sleeping in the high branches when she could. when she heard the drumming. It was not ordinary sound. It came from beneath the forest floor, rhythmic and slow, like a very large heart. She felt it in the soles of her feet before she heard it with her ears, and something in her body responded before her mind could form an opinion about whether that was wise. The bond behind her sternum, which had been a dull, persistent ache since she crossed the border, went quiet in its presence, the way a loud room goes quiet when something more commanding enters. She followed it. What she found at the end of the following was not what she expected. No fearsome creature, no trap, no monster built for killing. She found a standing stone in a clearing, ancient granite, shoulder height, covered in lichen of a deep and specific green she had never seen anywhere else, and around the base of the stone, in a ring of compressed moss, sat an old woman. The woman had the quality of age that moves past frailty into something else, something that does not fit on the spectrum between strong and weak. Her hair was the white of snow in shadow, blue-tinted. Her eyes, when she opened them to look at Marin, were gold, not amber. Gold, the color of the binding stone at the center of Duskvale's ritual circle. "You're the healer," the woman said, not a question. "I was," Marin said, because it felt more accurate now. "No." The woman gestured at the ground beside her with an unhurried hand. "Sit." Marin sat. The drumming in the earth was louder here, and she could feel now that it was not mechanical, it was living, a rhythm with breath underneath it, something aware. The woman's name was Sola. She had been the keeper of the standing stone in the harrowing for long enough that she counted time differently than Marin did. She spoke without much preamble, in the way people spoke when they were too old to value social architecture. The solstice binding didn't fail, Sola said. Your pack is telling itself a story. The bloodline requirement in the old text means wolfkin by bond, not by birth. 3 generations of keepers have misread it. The ritual completed. Your territory is sealed. The problem is that your alpha doesn't know that, and the council elder who filed the claim does know it, and has known it for 30 years, and has been waiting for an alpha without enough spine to contest it. Marin sat with that. The forest around them was still except for the drumming. You're saying Veer knew the exile order was built on a false reading? Veer wrote the false reading, introduced it into the commentary texts 40 years ago, patience being his particular gift. Sola opened her eyes fully then, and the gold in them was not warm, it was precise, like a measurement. The question isn't what Ver did. The question is what you're going to do with what you know. I would need proof, Marin said. The original texts, the unaltered commentary. Sola looked at her for a long moment. Then she reached beside her and placed in Marin's hands a small wooden box, the kind healers used for medicinal seals, but heavier. Inside was a sealed scroll in the oldest hand Marin had ever seen, the ink brown with age, the parchment intact because it had been stored in the cold stone place where temperature never changed. This is the unaltered keeper's record, Sola said, from before Veer's time. You'll need to present it to the full council, not just Duskvale's pack, if you want the ruling to hold. Marin held the box. She thought about the 4 days of closed door, about the wire being cut behind her sternum, about 36 pack members who had stood in the great hall and watched, and not one voice intervened. Why give this to me? She asked. Sola made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Because you walked into my forest instead of away from it. That means the territory recognizes you. The binding worked, girl. You're still this land's. The bond flickered in her chest, warm and then gone, like a candle in wind. She had 12 days before the quarterly council convening, where territorial claims and their challenges were aired before all 5 packs of the region. 12 days in which to understand what she held, prepare how to present it, and decide whether to go back. Not whether to forgive. That was a different question, with a different timetable, and she set it deliberately to one side. She was going back because she was right, and because Veer's forgery needed to be in front of the full council, and because her territory still knew her name. Whether Fenris deserved to benefit from that, whether she would allow him to stand beside her while she dismantled the lie he had helped enact by his silence, that she had not decided. She spent those 12 days in the harrowing. Sola taught her how to read the old ceremonial script, the archaic forms that the current keepers had lost. The original text was unambiguous once you had the grammar. Wolf kin by bond was the exact phrase, and the commentary Veer had added in the margins of the newer copies used a synonym for birth that changed the meaning entirely. It was the work of someone who had spent a long time learning to be patient with deception. She also learned something else. In those 12 days, the drumming in the earth, the thing she had felt in the soles of her feet when she first arrived in the harrowing, was not separate from her. Sola explained it the way she explained most things, plainly, without drama, as though it were simple information Maren had merely been inconvenienced in receiving. The bloodline the council claimed Maren lacked was a specific thing, the presence of a territorial spirit's claim on the blood, passed through wolf-kin generations. What Sola's stone had sensed, and what the drumming confirmed, was that Maren carried such a claim, not through a parent, but through herself. The pull in her chest that had drawn her north from the lowland settlement at 22, the reason the gatehouse guard had stepped aside, the reason Fenris had seen something in her from the window before she ever met his eyes. The territory had already chosen her. In the oldest way, territories claimed the people they wanted. She was not without lineage. She was lineage the pack had not thought to look for, because they had been looking in the wrong direction. The night before she returned, she sat with that knowledge and let herself feel, cleanly and without the interruption of the things she needed to do, the shape of what she had lost when Fenris signed that order. Not the status, not the house, him. The specific person who had caught her herbs before he caught her arm, who had sat across a runner's wound and learned the names of what she was doing. The one who knew about the lowland settlement and the elder who had kept her from inconvenience rather than love. The one who had said, "I want to know who you are," not what you know. He had known who she was, and he had signed the order anyway. She did not weep. She sat and she let it be exactly as large as it was, and she breathed through it, and then she packed the box into the center of her pack where it would survive any weather, and she slept. She reached Duskvale's southern gate 2 hours before the council's gathering was scheduled to begin, and the gate guard was the same young man who had removed her shackle at dawn 17 days ago. He looked at her with an expression she recognized, caught between protocol and conscience, and she did not make it easy for him. "I have business before the full council," she said. Under Clause 7 of the Territorial Charter, any exiled wolf may petition the council directly in open session within the 30-day window. Today is day 17. He checked nothing because he was not old enough to have memorized the charter clauses. He stepped aside because her voice carried exactly the register of someone who had already decided what would happen next. She walked through Duskvale's main corridor without breaking stride. The pack members she passed did not stop her. Some of them looked. She looked back, steadily, without challenge and without warmth, and kept moving. She came into the council chamber from the side entrance, and the full council, Duskvale's 5 members, plus the 4 representatives from the neighboring packs, was already in session, seated in the tiered arc of the old stone room. Elder Veer was in the 3rd chair. His face, when he saw her, did not change expression, which was itself information. Fenris was at the Alpha's position, at the base of the ark. She felt him before she saw him, the bond detonating like a struck bell the moment she entered the room, and her body's response was immediate and involuntary, and deeply, profoundly inconvenient. She kept walking. His head came up. Their eyes met across the full length of the chamber, and she watched the sequence of events in his face: recognition, shock, then something that was not relief so much as the expression of a person whose worst fear has just been replaced with a worse one. He had not expected her to come back armed. She could see that he had expected her not to come back at all, and that this had been the thing eating him for 17 days. She stood at the petitioner's position, and the chamber went quiet, and she placed the wooden box on the stone ledge in front of the council ark and said, "I invoke Clause 7. I have evidence material to the exile order filed against me by this body at the request of Elder Ver of Duskvale, and I am requesting an immediate hearing before the full council." There was a sound in the chamber, not agreement, not protest, the sound that rooms made when a situation had just changed its shape, and everyone needed a moment to catch up. The council head, an older woman from the Thornfell pack named Bran, looked at the box and then at Marin with the expression of someone who found surprises professionally useful. "Present your evidence." The bond was at full volume. Marin could feel Fenris standing 20 feet to her left with the precise and useless accuracy of someone who had spent 3 years learning the exact position of another person in every room. She did not look at him again. She opened the box, and she laid the scroll on the ledge, and she began. She spent 40 minutes speaking. She had prepared this the way she had prepared her healer's work in the first weeks at Duskvale, thoroughly, in anticipation of every challenge, with the evidence arranged so that each point built on the last. She read from the original text. She demonstrated the grammatical difference between wolfkin by bond and wolfkin by birth. She showed Veer's commentary addendum in the margin copies against the primary text. She presented the timeline of the forgery, which Sola had helped her construct, 40 years of a patient lie, introduced into secondary texts and never caught because no one had looked at the primaries. The chamber was very quiet. Ver's expression had not changed. That, more than anything, confirmed that he had known she was coming, or at least had considered the possibility, and had decided he would deal with it directly. He raised his hand when she finished. The healer's evidence is a document of uncertain provenance, produced during her exile in the Harrowing, which is not recognized territory of any legitimate pack, and carries no archival standing. The document's provenance is the Harrowing Archive, which predates Duskvale's founding charter by 80 years, Marin said, which means it predates this council's authority to challenge it. Veer was patient. She had known he would be. A single document, produced by a woman the council has already determined violated the most sacred ritual of this territory. "No," Marin said, and she heard her own voice be very steady. "A woman your forged commentary determined violated the ritual. The original text determines differently." She paused. "I would also note that the Harrowing Territory's drumming stone recognized my bond this month. Sola will testify to that before this council, and Sola's standing with the territorial spirits of this region has been established for longer than any person in this room has been alive." She looked at each face in the ark in turn, ending at Bran. The exile order was not a legal ruling. It was a mechanism for removing the Alpha's bonded mate from territory she had legitimately sealed. "I am requesting the order be struck from the record." Bran looked at the scroll for a long time. She looked at the other council members. She did not look at Ver. "This council will need to confer," she said. "We will reconvene in 1 hour." That hour was the longest Marin had spent since the 4 days of closed door. She had stepped into the side corridor to wait, and the corridor was dim and cold, and she stood against the stone wall with her pack at her feet and her hands loose at her sides, breathing. The bond was a constant pull toward the chamber where Fenris still stood. She had not looked at him directly again after the first exchange of eyes. She had not been ready, and she had been sensible enough to know it. The door of the corridor opened. He had to duck slightly to come through it, as he had always had to duck through doors designed by smaller people. He stopped when he saw her. Not surprise, she thought. He had known she was here, and for a moment he simply looked at her across the 6 feet of stone floor between them, as though he was trying to determine whether she was real. The bond roared. There was no other word for it. After 17 days of being a wire, a dull ache, a thing she had been carrying like a stone in her chest, the bond detonated the moment he was in the room with her, and her whole body felt it the way bodies felt the change in air before rain, total, unavoidable, flooding the space under her skin with the specific painful warmth of something that had always been true. She pressed her back against the wall. She looked at him and did not speak. Marin. Her name in his voice after 17 days of nothing was something she had not prepared for. It cracked a small, specific thing. "I have 1 hour," she said. "I don't want to spend it on this." "I know," he moved half a step, not toward her, not quite. The way a person moved when they needed to be closer to something, even if they had forfeited the right to close the distance. "I need you to know that I have been trying to reverse the order since the morning it was issued. That Ver filed with the council faster than I was able to build the counter-petition. That I sent 3 riders to find you in the harrowing, and not one of them." He stopped. "I should have let you come to me when the claim was filed, instead of trying to protect you from knowing how serious it was." "You should have not signed the order," Marin said. The silence between them was not comfortable. He did not try to make it comfortable. "Yes," he said. 4 days, Fenris. You were in that room for 4 days. I left meals outside your door." She did not raise her voice. She was very calm, and she understood that the calm was not detachment. It was the surface of something extremely large. "You could have come to me. We could have prepared together. Instead, you closed a door and then opened it to exile me in front of 43 people. I know. Don't tell me what you know. Tell me why." He looked at the floor and then at her, and she saw in his face the thing she had looked for every day for 17 days, in the part of her that was still, despite everything, attached to him. Genuine contraction, not performance of remorse, the actual cost of what he had done, written in his face the way wounds were written in tissue, not on the surface, but in the way everything around the wound had reorganized itself. "I was afraid," he said. "Veer told me, 4 days before the order, that if I contested the claim, he would bring the older violation, the one he had been sitting on for 30 years. The claim that my mother's binding also failed the bloodline requirement, and that my own alpha claim was therefore illegitimate." He paused. "I believed that if that came out before I could refute it, the pack would fracture. I signed your exile order because I thought I was protecting something larger." He looked at her steadily. "I was wrong. I was protecting myself, and I was wrong." The bond ached between them. She felt him feel her silence. "I'm not going to stand here and tell you that's enough," he said. "I don't believe it's enough. I wanted you to know the actual shape of it, because you deserve the actual shape of it, not the version that makes me easier to forgive." 6 feet of stone floor between them, the cold of the corridor, his hands at his sides. She stepped forward. Not all the way. 3 feet, not 6. Enough that she could see the texture of his breathing, the slight unsteadiness in the way he was holding himself. She reached out and placed one hand against his sternum, flat-palmed, where the bond lived under the skin in both of them. The warmth that came through that contact was not comfort, not yet. It was recognition, the bond acknowledging itself. It moved through her palm and up her arm, and through her sternum, and into the part of her that had been carrying the stone for 17 days, and the stone did not dissolve, but it shifted, became less a thing she was carrying, and more a thing that was part of her now, shaped by what it had survived. "I don't forgive you," she said quietly. "Not today. I need you to understand that is not a negotiating position. It is accurate information." His hand came up and covered hers, pressing her palm more firmly to his chest. His skin was warm through his shirt. His expression did not argue with her. "I know," he said. "But I am not leaving Duskvale," she said. "Not because of you. Because this is my territory, and the binding was correct, and I sealed it with my bond and my hands, and Veer does not get to have the version of history where he wins." She held his gaze. "You and I, that's a separate question. We will work through it separately, at my pace." He nodded. She felt his exhale through her palm. "I will stand beside you when the council reconvenes," he said. "Not to protect you. Because you are right, and I want to be on the correct side of the record." She searched his face. She did not find performance there. She found a man who had failed by the measurement of exactly the thing he valued most in himself, and who had arrived in this corridor because he needed her to know the exact shape of it, not because he expected forgiveness. She left her hand on his chest for 3 more breaths. Then she stepped back. "Then stand there," she said, "and don't speak unless I ask you to." The corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile, something smaller and more serious. Understood. The council reconvened in exactly 1 hour, and Bran called the chamber to order, with the decisive posture of someone who had reached a conclusion and was not interested in further delay. "This council has reviewed the material evidence submitted by Merrin of Duskvale," she began, and the thorn of Duskvale was not accidental, and Veer's hands on the stone ledge tightened slightly at it. "We have consulted the primary text archive accessible to the council under the regional charter, and the evidence submitted is consistent with primary source records held independently at Thornfell." She paused. "The commentary addendum attributed to Elder Ver is not consistent with the primary texts. This council finds that the exile order filed against Merrin of Duskvale was based on a deliberate misreading of the ritual requirement, introduced into secondary texts without council authorization." The chamber absorbed this. Elder Ver is suspended from this council, pending a full investigation into the scope of the alteration, including its application to prior exile rulings within living memory. Bran's voice did not rise. "The exile order against Merrin of Duskvale is struck from the record. Her mated status and territorial standing are confirmed. The solstice binding is upheld." The chamber's response was the sound of a room realigning around a new truth. Not loud, not dramatic. The collective adjustment of people who had believed one thing and were now being required to believe another, and most of whom were beginning to understand that they had been managed into the wrong belief for a very long time. Merrin stood at the petitioner's position and felt the ruling settle over her. Not triumph, something quieter and more structural. She had been right, and it was now the record. That was what she had come for. Ver was escorted from the chamber by the Thornfell representatives, and he went without making it ugly, which was the final confirmation of the kind of man he was, one who folded cleanly when the mechanism failed, having always known the mechanism would eventually fail. Fenris stood to her left and did not speak. When the chamber cleared, Corinna was the first person to reach her. The old healer stood in front of Marin for a moment, with her characteristic economy of expression, and then put both hands briefly on Marin's shoulders, pressing down with deliberate weight. A gesture that was Karena's specific version of well done, recognizable to anyone who had worked under her for more than a year. "You'll come back to the healer's house tomorrow," Karena said. "We're short on the wound-closing formula, and you're the only one who makes it correctly." "I know," Marin said, and felt the first real warmth of the day move through her. The pack members who had stood in the Great Hall 17 days ago came, one by one, over the following hour. Not with elaborate apology. She did not want elaborate apology, and most of them seemed to sense this, but with the smaller acknowledgments that were more honest. A nod, a quietly spoken name, one young woman who simply touched Marin's arm and kept walking. Each one was a thread being retied. Marin accepted each one as it came, without performance, without magnanimity, simply as what they were. People who had failed her and were now trying to be different, and whether she would eventually trust them was information the future would carry. Fenris waited until the chamber was empty. She had been aware of him waiting, the bond humming steadily between them, warm and patient and entirely without pressure, the way it had been in the early months before anything had been named. She finished her last conversation and turned, and he was standing near the door, his alpha collar held in his hands rather than at his throat, which was the most stripped-down version of himself she had ever seen him present in public. She crossed the chamber to him. The distance closed steadily, unhurried, and when she was close enough, she looked at the collar and then at his face. "I meant what I said in the corridor," she told him, "about the pace. This will take time." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking for anything tonight." "Good." She looked at him for another moment. The bond between them was a full, warm, living thing, not the wire it had been for 17 days, not the candle in wind. It had come back into itself the way rivers came back into themselves after the force that had diverted them was removed. Not the same water, exactly, but the same body, the same direction, the same persistent course toward the same inevitable place. She reached up and took the collar from his hands. She did not put it on him. She held it between them, a weight they were both touching, a declaration of nothing yet and everything eventual. "Start by being someone I can trust again," she said. "One day at a time." The lodge stood on the hill above the main hall, where it had always stood, and the forest cupped it from 3 sides in the specific darkness of old trees, and the stars above the harrowing to the north were sharp and bright and without judgment. Marin walked through Duskvale's gate in the late evening of a day that had cost her everything she had prepared and given her back what she had come with. Her rightness, her standing, the cold, clear bedrock of knowing who she was. Korena's healer's house was warm and smelled of yarrow and nettle and the clean mineral scent of clean stone, and the pallet in the back room, where Marin had always slept, had fresh linens, put there by someone who had known she would be coming home tonight. She set the wooden box on the workbench. She sat on the edge of the pallet. The bond hummed in her chest, warm and present, and hers. Not his, not theirs yet, not again yet. Hers, the part of it that had always belonged to the territory, to the drumming stone in the harrowing, to the pull that had brought her north at 22, to the wolfkin claim written in her blood by the land itself, not by inheritance but by choice, by the territory reaching out and saying, "You," and meaning it. She had done what she came to do. The record was corrected. Ver was gone. The binding held. Her name was on the right side of the truth. She lay down on the pallet and looked at the ceiling and breathed. Tomorrow she would make the wound-closing formula. Tomorrow she would begin the long, necessary work of rebuilding trust through action, one honest day following another. Tomorrow there would be decisions and conversations, and the careful reconstruction of something that had been broken by a man who was genuinely trying to understand what it had cost to break it. Tonight, she let herself be still. The territory held her with the same quiet certainty it had always held her. From the first moment she crossed the gatehouse threshold with 30 silver coins and a healer's knowledge and a pull in her chest she could not name. The land knew her. The land had always known her. That was, in the end, where she was from. That was the only bloodline that had ever mattered, and it had been hers the entire time.